Thanks very much. It is an honor to be here today. I've been able to attend quite a few of the Geary seminar series since joining this institution, and it's fun to be on the other side, although I do miss getting to see faces in person. So I look forward to your questions at the end. So as Darren mentioned, like my research focuses on youth and political violence. And as we kind of know, even when there is a peace accord, so kind of formal agreement or ending of the conflict, threats remain. And those are often quite dynamic, even in the immediate post-accord period of the first generation after war. And in particular, there are changes at the kind of the macro system, so the larger national level. And one of the things that we've done across some number of studies is tried to look at how those macro system changes year after year can affect child development. And in particular, within psychology, those changes, that dynamic post-accord period has implications for internalizing problems. So that could be things like depression, anxiety, or post-traumatic stress, as well as what we call externalizing behaviors, so things like aggression, or even perpetrating violence against the former conflict rivals, as well as for intergroup attitudes and behaviors. So these can be things like prejudice and intergroup interactions. But while the majority of this research focuses on factors that may perpetuate the conflict, I've, in the last decade or so, really tried to focus on what processes can help build peace. And so for those more in the psychology, education, sociology, you might be very familiar with the model on the left there. That's the social ecology of human development. And really here, the emphasis is how different levels of society, so the macro, exo, or micro system, can affect the developing individual. So if you note, the arrows are kind of pointing down. We typically try to understand how these factors affect, let's say, a given child. Whereas on the right, this is coming from the peace studies paradigm. And this would be kind of some of my interdisciplinary training. And typically this is looking at how an individual might make a personal decision to engage in more peaceful relations. That has implications for how they interact with others. And ultimately, those can lead to more and broader forms of structural change. So for example, legislative change and cultural change. So kind of overarching norms. And you'll notice here that the arrows are often pointing out. So how these individual decisions motivate people to take part in kind of broader collective action. And so what I've done is to try to kind of use these two perspectives and integrate them a bit more. This is an open access article just from last year or 2 years ago now that was really looking at what can young people do in terms of agentic participation to build peace? So kind of what are the types of behaviors they can engage in at the individual or relational level? And even broader, where can we recognize their contributions, let's say, to structural change? So collective action, civic engagement, and even the broadest forms of cultural change. So activism, global petitions, and even voting intentions when they turn of age in those societies. And so here we kind of looked at the different ways that young people can participate in potential peace building. And then so those may be less familiar with peace building is constructive engagement that addresses the immediate impact as well as the root causes of both episodic and structural violence. So episodic is what we may typically think of when we think of fatalities or conflict-related deaths, whereas structural violence are those broader systemic factors such as racism that are kind of embedded within the social system. In the UN operationalizing peace building across two domains. So one is nonviolent conflict transformation, so the ways, for example, that people engage with the ultimate goal of sustainable peace and development. So this is where it starts to connect with the sustainable development goals. And in essence, peace building involves persistent pro-social action. So it needs to be sustained over time, and there needs to be just actions, not actual just behaviors, or attitudes or kind of intentions. And I would say and have argued that for young people, particularly children and adolescents, we might understand peace building in terms of its antecedents. And by that, I specifically mean outgroup pro-social behavior. So this would be defined particularly in a complex setting as helping, sharing, or otherwise being pro-social toward the former conflict rival. And beyond those interpersonal relationships, so at that kind of microsystem level, we'd understand it as well as kind of the broader forms of pro-social action across the social ecology. So in the literature, particularly in psychology, and I'll transition more to interdisciplinary work at the end of this talk, the focus has been on these, what we call pro-social behaviors, or voluntary acts that benefit another without personal or external reward. And the literature that has looked at this in terms of its impact, in terms of political violence, has found kind of two sets of findings, kind of two different main effects. The first is a positive link. So young people that are exposed to more political violence have more pro-social action. And that's, for example, in Uganda, Palestine, and Lebanon. And on the other hand, there's been kind of a negative link, which is that youth who are exposed to more political violence have less or lower pro-social behavior. And to try to make sense of these findings, I've developed a series of studies that kind of try to tease apart these potential differences. The first has focused on the target of pro-social action, so toward who is one helping, toward which set of actors. And the target typically in psychology is often unspecified, so it's considered more of a general or overall behavior, as well as we mentioned in that kind of the developmental peacebuilding model, specifically thinking about the type of pro-social behavior. So is it at the interpersonal level, or is it toward broader structural change? Finally, because I am a developmental psychologist, I think about the timing of exposure. So at what point in the child's life versus at what point in the study was the data collected? And may there be kind of typical or normative changes in pro-social behavior between childhood and adolescence and into young adulthood that we're kind of capturing at different times based on the populations that we study, and kind of what implications does that have for the overall picture and understanding how peace building may develop across countries and within different populations. So again, trying to go kind of beyond this typology, also shared us a series of studies that are supporting this developmental peace building model, or the DPM. And then at the end, share some new kind of developing research and that's trying to study more of the impact. So again, I'll start with what predicts youth peace building, thinking of the kind of the down arrows from the Bronfenbrenner model. And then does it work? So can youth change these broader social structures? And this is the kind of the overall model that I'll be working with. So again, this is kind of the integration of the social ecology and the peace building paradigm, kind of recognizing what predicts peace building on the left with the black arrows, and does it work on the right with the purple arrows. I'm happy to come back to this as well at the end. So the first series of studies uses a theory called social identity development theory. And here are just some of the papers, and happy to share this if anyone wants to know more. And this is kind of focused more on that microsystem or the individual child level. Part of the Helping Kids Lab, which is based here at University College Dublin. We've also done research in Northern Ireland, and based on the funding at the time and where we were working, this particular set of data was also conducted in the Republic of Northern Macedonia and in Kosovo. So just for your orientation, but we've also done research here in the Republic as well as Croatia and Israel. But this particular study focuses on these three contexts. And one of the things that we were interested in based on social identity development theory is, when do young children growing up in these situations of political divide understand what those social categories are and the features or the symbols that represent those categories? So for example, I'll just share the Northern Ireland ones here. We would show picture kids of different streets or bunting and say which one is Catholic or which one is Protestant. And we might also say which one is Irish or which one is British, using the national categories as well as the ethno-religious political ones. We would show them different signs and symbols that they may have seen, but not necessarily have a deeper affiliation with, to get an idea of exposure. Things that may be meaningful to them, like football, badges, and other sport. And finally, we also want to test kind of the boundaries of this. So we use things that would be more obscure if you didn't happen to grow up in a particular neighborhood, but we wanted you to see, based on the signs and symbols used, for example, in these murals in Belfast, would kids know which community background or which national background we're associated with. So for example, here's just some of the findings that we looked at. We ran these studies with kids from ages 5 to 11, for example, and what we found is that the national category, so the saliency of being Irish or British, emerged earlier than the saliency of the ethno-political labels, meaning Catholic or Protestant. So at a younger age, kids were correctly able to identify, let's say, a certain sign or symbol with the hypothesized category, so that the Irish flag was Irish, for example. But we see overall that those increase with time. So as they spend time, as you know, in the divided education systems, they become more aware of those signs and symbols with age. This is also just some of the data that shows a similar kind of pattern and trend from the Macedonia. Here again, the kids were 6 to 11 just because they start primary school a year later. So we just basically started with them once they reached the school age. And again, they don't kind of would typically only use the same ethno-religious categories, being Macedonian or Albanian. And again, you see this kind of increase over age or time spent within the separate education system. And in particular, by ages 10 and 11, those kids are sorting everything in the correct direction. So there's a ceiling effect. We're not able to come up with obscure symbols that they don't know. And that even included some ones that we thought would be a little bit harder, for example. So there's some major squares, and they were able to like identify historic war leaders from one side or the other. And then again, what we're interested in is what kids do based on these social categories. So here we have a fun sticker sharing task. And again, in the case of Northern Ireland, we might say you have 7 stickers. On the left, we have Aoife, she is Catholic. On the right, we have Elizabeth, she is Protestant. Who do you want to share your stickers with? And they can drag and drop them to the respective child. So we want to see kind of what do they do when given the choice to distribute resources. And here what we found, again, is predicted by the social identity development theory model. So with child age, children have a greater preference for their symbols, and that's across the 3 contexts, Northern Ireland, Kosovo, and Macedonia. And that greater preference, so preferring symbols associated with one's in-group, leads to less giving, so less sharing, less out-group giving. And what we find with this mediational model is, although the size of the effects varies based on the situation, the overall model is the same, so the overall process. And one of the main things we do in this body of work is try to tease out kind of what is context specific and what might be more universal or underlying or cross-cultural. In a second set of studies, this is particularly working with older adolescents, we were thinking a little bit about those broader forms or types of prosocial action. So not just kind of the simple sharing task, particularly with outgroup members, but kind of broader forms of peace building. So this is kind of at that more structural or mesosystem level. And here we developed a support for peace building scale. And again, this was in particular in the context of Northern Ireland. So we did a combination of qualitative and quantitative research to develop these items for the scale. For example, about symbolic reparations, such as the bridge in Derry, Londonderry, repainting some of the murals, again, because that was salient to our children from the earlier study. Recognition of potentially political leaders and disrupting the chance for peace building, and things like shared education and shared sports teams. So these would be things that children themselves can participate in, but that have structural meaning in terms of the organization of social life in Northern Ireland. And what we found here, again, and I'll just talk about this figure kind of briefly and happy to come back to any questions as well, is that the amount and the quality of intergroup contacts, so how frequently you interacted with somebody from the other community, as well as how good that contact was, how pleasant it was, related positively to greater support for peace building. So if you were having positive intergroup interactions, you were more likely to support those items on our peace building scale. And what was particularly relevant is that support for the peace building, so saying you endorse these types of items, had positive implications or positive associations with later volunteering and political participation. And these kids were all between 14 and 16 years old. So they were doing things like taking part in walks against cancer, as well as boycotting, let's say, makeup that was tested on animals. So they were, the volunteering, the political participation were particularly non-sectarian. So we had a little qualitative follow-up that asked what types of actions they were doing, not just how many, and those were the kinds of responses they gave. So overall, again, what this finds is that these positive intergroup interactions has implications for how much they support peace building, and then for the types of kind of constructive social actions they take part in. So far I've kind of presented these in isolation, so these kind of interpersonal prosocial behaviors, and then the broader forms of civic engagement. And here is a paper that tried to connect across the levels of the social ecology. So again, just we've already defined prosocial behavior, but civic engagement in particular is actions that enhance the greater good. Again, it can be community participation, active action, advocacy, or participation in political life. There's been quite a bit of work on this kind of globally, and a relatively less in terms of thinking about civic engagement after political violence. And again, just a simplified drawing here, but essentially what we have is the same children over 6 different years. So we followed up in a longitudinal study, and over the course, the whole sample is between ages 10 and 20. So roughly we're able to estimate those types of developmental change between kind of middle childhood and young adulthood. And on the y-axis, you have prosocial behavior. So that kind of general helping behavior, the target not specified. And what we see here is kind of two different trajectories. So two different types of change. The first is for those youth and children who are exposed to higher sectarianism. So again, in the case of Northern Ireland, this would be things like bombs being thrown over a peace wall, being called in by someone from the other community. At age 10, children who were exposed to more sectarianism had higher prosocial behavior. So you see the gray line there is higher than the black line. So that's that positive association we see kind of in the literature in the beginning. However, with time, so over this developmental period, over the 6 years of our study, children who were exposed to higher sectarianism, so the gray line, decrease faster in their prosocial behavior. So we see this sharper decrease. And in the end, by age 20, they're lower in overall prosocial behavior than children who are exposed to lower levels of sectarianism. So here we see that opposite. We see the negative association. And kind of one of the benefits of this type of modeling and these types of data and samples that I had the access to work on is that we're able to see why we might find conflicting findings when we look at a series of studies in different areas, because we might be capturing different points of that developmental trajectory. So again, the take-home message here is that at age 10, children who are exposed to higher sectarianism actually are more prosocial in general, but that decreases or faster than kids who are exposed to lower levels of sectarianism. And what's interesting is both these trajectories are related to both political and social engagement. So again, trying to connect across levels of the social ecology, these overall just kind of generic helping behaviors have implications for later civic engagement. So the kind of the broader structural forms. So again, there's this initial shallow decrease in prosocial behaviors that decreases or turns down more sharply in the later teen years. Exposure to sectarianism, so this intergroup threat, accelerates that decrease in prosocial behavior. And again, I didn't report on this in the figure, but girls are higher in initial prosocial behavior, but the slope, that change is the same for boys and girls. And so this has certain intervention implications. Well, we want to intervene prior to the sharp decrease, right? So while there's kind of that relatively shallow period, those would be optimal times for intervention. We need to target youth who are exposed to more sectarianism, so maybe who are living in higher crime neighborhoods. And in particular, we need to engage in this particular context, non-school age youth. So really by age 16, kids can leave formal schooling in Northern Ireland. And so that might be part of that precipitous drop-off. Maybe the school is a protective environment. It provides and affords opportunities for that type of engagement or those prosocial behaviors. And if they are outside of those school environments, how can we provide similar types of contexts? So again, this is kind of the series of studies, and now we're switching to kind of trying to link across what are some of those individual characteristics that young people might have that relate to their attitudes, but ultimately to their prosocial action. And so this is testing Batson, who is a social psychologist. He came up with the empathy attitudes action model and did a lot of research, particularly with adults. And so part of the Helping Kids lab was to try to adapt these for developmental purposes, to understand at what ages do this process emerge. So the idea was we would assess empathy. People who are higher in empathy or for whom empathy is induced for particular targets would have more positive attitudes about outgroup members, and those attitudes in turn would lead to prosocial action. So again, we've tested this across a couple of different studies, including storybook vignettes, for example, where we tell children about other people in need. And then we've also measured what we call dispositional or kind of general trait empathy, as well as outgroup specific empathy. So how much empathy you would feel, for example, if an outgroup child was hurt. And then we varied the target, again, trying to tease out if these like specific versus universal factors. So for example, we've used relatively novel outgroups in the case, let's say, of Northern Ireland. So that would be refugees, as well as the conflict rival outgroup in that particular setting. And then we've also looked at different types of action. So that donation task, similar to stickers, and we've used other kind of realistic helping behaviors. So for example, saying as a new student is coming to their school, their form teacher asks you to sign up to help orient them and sit with them at lunch. How many days are you willing to do that? You know, so asking them to kind of indicate those behaviors. And what we found here, and in particular, this was one of the refugee studies, and again, this is an adolescent sample over 2 time points, was that the general dispositional empathy, so how empathetic a child felt in general, related to more positive outgroup attitudes toward ethnic minorities at the later time point, so about 6 months later. And those more positive attitudes had implications for the realistic helping behaviors. So again, this would be things like sharing a book with the newcomer or sitting with him or her at lunch. It also had positive implications for collective action. So these were a series of items that asked, like, how likely are you to take part in a protest or demonstration on behalf of refugees in Belfast? So kind of realistically where they could go, what types of behaviors could they engage in? And then we also had a petition that was actually active at the time. This was from the United Nations, #WithRefugees. And we kind of set up the paradigm so it looked believable and asked them, would you want to sign this petition or not? So again, that's at the broader kind of macro level change. So what's key about this is at those lower levels of the social ecology, the young person may actually interact with this person, so the outgroup member, so sharing something with them, sitting with them at lunch. But those meso and macro system behaviors are intentions that at least they may never see the direct implications of those acts. And so now we're shifting a little bit of kind of what are the things that predict peace building or youth engagement in pro-social actions. So that could be things like the empathy we've talked about, and it could be things like the development of these social categories, to try to understand what is the impact of those types of actions. And so this takes kind of a different, it kind of flips the empirical lens. And to do this, we kind of took a different interdisciplinary approach, and you all may be familiar with Cochrane and Campbell have these series of gap maps. And in one of those, they do these systematic inquiries, and one is particularly about peace building. And again, I'll zoom in on the part that's relevant here, but the youth column is particularly scarce when compared to other things like gender, et cetera. And one of the places that we do see some evidence, so kind of identifying the gap, it's around connecting peace building with young people, where they do occur, maybe more around services and education. So for example, training to kind of bring former child soldiers into social life. So in order to kind of complement that overall peace building gap map and the recognition that there's relatively little out there on youth, we did our own rapid evidence review, and we picked kind of 4 primary disciplines: economics, psychology, sociology, and education. And we looked at the top 10 relevant journals in each of those fields over the last 20 years to identify any citations that linked youth and peace. And then when we looked across those, there were kind of 6 primary gaps in that academic literature. One was it's relatively scarce, particularly outside of education and psychology. There is not often a focus on children, adolescents, or youth within the sociology or economics area. Typically, when it is there, the constructive agency is overlooked. So it thinks, and often youth are positioned kind of as victims versus as peacemakers themselves. If there is a focus on any of those kind of developmental periods, they're roughly studied in isolation, and this applies as well to the psychology and educational journals. So it's rare to have studies that kind of connect across different developmental periods. And as you've seen kind of in my own work as well, it's very common to focus on single case or single country work, right? Once we have the context, we have the samples, and we know the language, et cetera, and that's great, but it does limit our ability to think about the generalizability and the potential universal or specific processes. Typically, it's also at a single level of analysis. This has changed in the last 6 years, so we're seeing more multi-level analysis, but it was relatively rare over the 20-year period. And again, the emphasis is often on, for those familiar with Galtung and peace studies, kind of the negative piece, so the absence of violence, and an emphasis on conflict-affected countries. So one of the things that this particular new project tries to do is to think about peace building on a continuum. So peace building can happen in a place like the Republic of Ireland. It can happen in other established democracies. We want to understand how it looks and feels different in those different settings. So whether there has been a history of political violence or whether there hasn't been. And so within that rapid evidence review, kind of led us to identify 4 peace-building dimensions. And what we wanted to understand is, how do those dimensions vary within and between country? And what are those implications for quality peace? And again, the emphasis on quality peace versus negative peace is to try to understand peace on a continuum. So that includes kind of what we might think of traditionally as a conflict-affected country, as well as a more stable kind of democracy. And so we want to understand how those peace-building dimensions change over time and what their implications are for this quality peace. And so again, key into this is to have a time series analysis and to include a broader sample. So does it look and feel the same in conflict and non-conflict countries? And again, just to go through the dimensions here, and happy to talk more about them in the Q&A period. One of the key ones was education. So again, so the key one is education. So this is how often and for how long are children in school, as well as kind of what is the university enrollment. Engagement as well. So this is how active civil society organizations are in a particular country. Access to information includes both kind of things like digital access, so spread of internet, as well as free and fair media. And then inclusion, and this is defined kind of through a grievance scale, particularly around ethnicity and gender. So the kind of idea was to think about those two domains of sustainable development and nonviolent conflict transformation. And here, these 4 dimensions can be assessed within those domains. And there are 2 analytical approaches that I used here. One is probably more familiar to the audience, or many of you in the audience. This will be the latent growth curve model, and it's similar to what underpinned some of the earlier things that we saw. And the idea here is that there's underlying change, and can we assess what happens over the course of a decade at the national level? And a relatively newer application of this next is called a multi-level time series network analysis. So again, folks in the audience may be familiar with time series analysis, network analyses are kind of what are the associations across different variables or nodes or circles in this case. And the benefit of using this time series approach is it says these networks may change with time, and that there are going to be different networks among and within a country, as well as between 2 different countries. So the multi-level time series network analysis allows us to study both what are the changes within a network, within a country, as well as what are the differences across countries among many different factors. I put this example up of typing speed, and just it will also maybe help orient us a little bit to the idea of how network analyses look, as the circles are the nodes or the constructs, the things we're assessing. And the temporal networks, so the first one on the right there, is within person, within time. So this is just an example. So there might not be any association between, so there's no line connecting the 2 nodes between typing speed and spelling errors. However, if we look at the over time, if we look at the contemporaneous network, so that's also within person, we might see that there's a positive association. So that's a green arrow, and the thicker the bar is, the stronger the association, and green is positive and red is negative. So for example, if I my own self am typing really fast, I might make more spelling errors. And then the between subjects network is the one on the far right panel, and there we see there's a negative association between typing speed and spelling errors when we compare across people. So if I'm really fast at typing, I will make fewer errors perhaps than someone who is really slow. So if we're comparing across us, that's a negative association. So I'm going to go kind of in essence of time, I'm going to skip through the latent growth curve. A lot of these associations are kind of what you would expect, and I think maybe less interesting than the time series network analysis. So in general, when we model quality peace, so how much change is there and the amount of peace, there was a shallow positive linear increase. So we have all nations over the course of a decade, and there was kind of a small positive increase on average across that decade. And then we wanted to understand how those youth peace building dimensions related to this trajectory of quality peace. Kind of on average, things are going up, but what does it have? What changes about that when we know how the youth are participating in peace building within each nation? And again, here are just some summaries, and I'm happy to come back to them. A lot of the ways that this got to be modeled depended on kind of what data was available at what time points. So in essence, education has a positive implication for the initial value or the intercept of quality peace, and for the slope, so how much it increases over time. Engagement has a positive association within years, so kind of within time point, if there's higher levels of civil society participation, then quality peace is also higher. The access to information, so this would be kind of digital media as well as free and fair press, and as that got better, so as that changed and improved, so did quality peace. And similar to inclusion, so while it was initially negatively related to that, as inclusion increased, quality peace increased as well, again, over the course of a decade. And when we compared these types of models in conflict and non-conflict countries, so whether a conflict occurred during that 10-year period, there was initial lower levels of quality peace in conflict countries, but the slopes didn't change, which means that conflict maybe affected the overall level of quality peace, but not how quality peace changed over the course of a decade. So again, those are kind of more the traditional models of latent growth curve analyses, and here we get into the newer type of modeling applied to these type of data. And here, just a quick orientation. So QP is quality peace, and then each of the other circles represents one of the youth peace building dimensions. And so here what we see is there are positive associations, so the green, between education and quality peace, while engagement and information are indirectly related to quality peace through education. And the inclusion here, again, is a bit wonky in that it's actually measures of exclusion, but I'm trying to use the positive way, but you'll see that's why it's a red line, but you can interpret the depth or the intensity of the line as that association. So again, this is the within country, within time network. Then we looked at the within country over time network. So this is a 1-year lag that says, how does this network change with time? What's the association of these over the course of from 1 year to the next? And here we see all 4 peace building dimensions have a positive association with quality peace as well over time. And so that's the single-headed arrow for the lagged effects. And then finally, this is kind of more where the latent growth curve idea picks up. So when we look at the between country effects, so if we're comparing, let's say, Ireland to Zimbabwe, right? So it's not what's happening within Ireland, but what's happening when we compare across countries. Again, education has a strong positive association with quality peace, whereas information and engagement are kind of through education. Information has its own small association as well. So countries with a higher and freer press are more likely to have quality peace across different countries. So it may feel a little bit like this for those who are familiar with It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. One of the challenges of doing interdisciplinary work is often you feel like kind of you're all over the map, you're using different methods, but I will try to bring us back to a slightly neater and tidier picture. So in the end, I'm interested in how young people engage in pro-social action and the implications of that action. And so I try to develop a series of studies that looks across different levels to study kind of what are the different types of behaviors, who are they choosing to help, and what are the factors that enhance that kind of form of youth peace building, and does that youth peace building make a difference? So can they start to shift both the relational elements within their immediate context, such as school, broader structural change, or even at the broadest form kind of larger cultural trends. So for example, more inclusion of refugees. And so one of the things I'm interested in is looking at these changes between and within countries and thinking again about quality peace, so allowing us to compare across with a focus on youth, and in particular using these 4 dimensions. And I would argue that similar to kind of the shift and all of a sudden recognition of gender in the early 2000s did to the field of peace studies, I think this is a trend that's happening within the focus of youth. And it connects very much with the UN's Youth, Peace, and Security Agenda. So since 2015, there's been a series of Security Council resolutions that have really emphasized the role of young people. And I think the academic literature is now trying to catch up and kind of support some of those practitioner calls. So thanks very much to all of you. See, like there's been literally thousands of kids and families and schools that have participated, and 2 of my main PIs on some of the data that I was presenting from today, and then some of the funders for those forms of data collection. So thanks very much. I look forward to your questions here.